office currently in the US. Normally I'm in the Rabat office. And yeah, really excited to be sharing some of these ideas and hearing feedback from you all on them today. Cool.
Hi everyone, I'm Chau. I'm a senior associate in the Rabat office. I haven't been around for nearly as long as neither Mallika nor Zack, but I'm also very excited to be here and talk to you guys about the work that we have been doing on valuing new information.
Cool. Thanks, Zack and Chau. We also have a few other members of our team who are not presenting today but have joined. So Claire and Eloisa, shout out, hi. Cool, awesome. Yeah, I think we are ready to get started. We've crossed the 20 participant mark, which was my personal threshold. And so I'm gonna jump in. Cool. So yeah, I'd just like to start by giving you a quick rundown of how we plan to use the next 55 minutes or so. We'll give you a brief introduction of IDinsight, spend some time talking about why we started to think about these questions and what, in our heads, the problem statement is and what's motivating all of this work. And so I'll do those two sections and then hand over to Zack to actually go through the method and the approach itself, like what is value information, what is this approach all about, and how do we answer those questions we are asking ourselves. And then Chau will talk to you a little bit about, our record of working on this at IDinsight so far and some of the technical and other questions that are on our minds as we look ahead, to the future of this work and actually using it more and more in real world situations. So we want to use about, 30 minutes or so to get through this content and give you all an understanding of how we're thinking about this, but we also hope that, we'll have enough time to discuss, hear your feedback, hear if you think this approach might actually be valuable, for your day-to-day work, and if not, why not? So as Zack said, really excited to get feedback from all of you. Before that, we'll spend some time kind of sharing our thoughts on this. Okay, so yeah, just to start with a 2-minute introduction to what IDinsight does. IDinsight is presenting a number of sessions at gLOCAL this year. I'm excited to be the first one, so I don't have to worry about you having heard this before. But IDinsight is a mission-driven global advisory. We also do a lot of data analytics and research work, and the goal that we kind of, are serving is to help global development leaders really maximize the social impact they are having via their work. And so to do that, we, typically tailor a pretty wide range of evidence and data tools. Like we started off doing a lot of randomized decision-focused evaluations. Now we have kind of expanded our toolkit to include, some of the newer things on the block, like machine learning. We do a lot of process evaluations, we do a lot of monitoring work, but all of that is basically geared towards helping decision makers really design the most effective programs that they can within their constraints and to kind of rigorously test what actually works to support the communities that they're serving. And, we have been around for about 10 years. We work with governments, multilaterals, foundations, all kinds of nonprofits, and we have offices sort of across the world. This map coloration shows you a little bit about where we've worked in the past. But basically, having looked at what we kind of are aiming to do, like in the last 10 years, we've done a ton of evaluations, and we do program evaluations to help support decision makers understand how their programs are doing and how they could do better all the time. Like that's kind of our bread and butter, and has been for a while. And yeah, to give you a more kind of concrete example of a classic decision-focused evaluation we do and that we've done, and that is kind of the foundation for all of our questions around like how do we make decisions about what evaluations to do. I'll share a quick example of an evaluation we did back in 2018, and this was for GiveWell, and they wanted to know the effect of a promising NGO called New Incentives, which was using back then conditional cash transfers to encourage caregivers in northern Nigeria to fully immunize their children. So that was kind of like what the NGO was doing. And then GiveWell, which is a philanthropic organization based in the US, who was thinking about whether they could potentially name this NGO one of their top charities, wanted to know, okay, like what is the effect that this NGO's work is actually having. So we did an RCT to estimate how effective new incentives was, and found that its program, its conditional cash transfer program, increased immunization rates in that region by more than 15 percentage points, and that was enough to make them more cost effective than many alternative uses of GiveWell's funds. And so our RCT contributed, and the findings from the RCT contribute to GiveWell's ultimate decision to designate new incentives as one of its top charities, and that designation in turn led to millions of dollars in additional funding flowing to new incentives. Since then, since that funding decision that was based on the RCT evidence, new incentives has scaled up its operations across northern Nigeria, and is thinking of where to go beyond, and is planning to reach around 3 million children over the next couple of years. And that in turn, of course, is helping reduce the incidence of preventable disease and death via well-proven vaccinations. So that's kind of like a typical story for us at IDinsight. There's a funder or a decision maker who states their need. In this case, it was GiveWell asking us like, how effective is this NGO? And we as IDinsight think about our skill set and the feasibility of doing it, and then usually based on those feasibility questions, we decide, usually mutually with the decision maker, whether to proceed with that evaluation. So to kind of summarize like a few things that we typically consider when we think about like, should we evaluate or should we not? One, the decision makers express need. Why do they need the evaluation, and like how are they going to use those results? And then we also think about, as a next step, like what's the feasibility? So based on that need and the evidence that's required, we kind of calculate the cost of going out and collecting that evidence, and then that's kind of compared to the decision maker's budget and the decision maker's constraints. We also think about stuff like, okay, how long will it take us to do this kind of study? What are the decision makers' timelines? We think about like our own skill set. Are we the right people to do this? Do we have the right experience? And if all of that kind of shakes out well, then typically we make the decision to like do the evaluation. And so, yeah, I think like the main considerations, to take it one level of abstraction away from that specific new incentives example, is that like the main considerations here when deciding whether or not to proceed with an evaluation are, the cost of the evaluation, whether we can come up with a research design that produces credible evidence, what is the question at hand, whether we can do it within a reasonable time frame and budget. So all of these kind of like feasibility, cost side of things, which are like reasonably tangible and easy to identify, like that, drives the decision in a big way. But what about the benefits? Like sometimes, as you'll see in this kind of expanded version of the decision makers need box, like sometimes we might take the thinking around the benefits of the study a little deeper. Like we might include reasoning like, all right, like there's a need, we are unsure about the program's impact, and a study might reduce or is likely to reduce that uncertainty. Therefore, it's beneficial to do an evaluation so that we can be more confident in the program before we decide to invest any more in it. That's like reasonable logic. We might also think on the benefit side, okay, like, yes, the study has some costs, but the study will also add to local and global knowledge about what development interventions work. And that's really valuable. So that's something we see as a benefit. There may be other demonstrative benefits, like, we want to use the results to unlock more funding for our program. But largely speaking, like, especially when you compare it to the costs and the feasibility side of this cost-benefit equation, the benefit side is typically answered with somewhat fuzzier, more subjective logic, and that's not a bad thing. But it's kind of was the foundation of like our thinking around this. Like, can we make the thinking around the benefit side especially more rigorous? Like, how can we make it more systematic, remove some of the subjectivity, and ultimately lead us to more optimal decisions about whether evaluations are worth doing or not? And as we thought about this, like the very specific question we asked ourselves is like, how many decision makers are in the development sector, especially, like, are asking themselves, okay, here's a study with a certain cost, but how much, on the other side, how much do we expect our social impact as an organization or as a government to improve based on the information generated by this study, right? Like, that's the benefit side of the equation. That's really important to consider. And we thought that when this question is left unanswered, or in many cases even unasked, it makes it really likely that the research funding will be suboptimally allocated, with potentially too much funding going towards studies that are low value from an impact perspective, and not enough funding going potentially to studies that, you know, would generate high value and high social impact. Because it's kind of a combination of these two things in the matrix, right? There's like the cost side of the equation, which is, you know, as I said earlier, like often asked and is fairly easy to answer. But there's also this kind of like, you know, the side of like the benefits that are either like not asked, or like when they are asked are kind of difficult to answer in like rigorous and kind of subjective ways. So yeah, I think like basically our VOI approach that we're going to talk to you a lot more about when I hand over to Zack takes this decision and this problem around how to quantify the benefits that may accrue from a study as its starting point. And basically, we asked ourselves, is there a way to quantify these benefits from a study so that we can more credibly weigh the costs of generating new information against the value we expect to derive from that information? We think that if we asked ourselves this question more often and found a fairly reasonable way to answer it, all of it might lead to kind of more optimal allocation of research funding in the development sector. And this problem just isn't just like relevant to the binary of like, should we do or shouldn't we do new research, or should we pursue an evaluation, shouldn't we pursue an evaluation? It's also applicable to how we do the research and the design choices and the trade-offs that we make as we try and fit the research to the decision makers' needs and timelines and budgets. So, for example, like even when we make the decision that, okay, new research is clearly valuable, it's clearly cost-effective, we still have to decide how to run the study. And at IDinsight, we make these decisions and these design choices with the client's decision needs in mind. And our intent is to deliver good enough evidence within the time, budget, bureaucratic, and other constraints facing a client. And that allows us to, you know, pretty comfortably depart from the methodological rules of thumb that come from, you know, academia, when we think a different approach is good enough for the decision at hand. But even as we do this, like, we ask ourselves the question, like, how do we define good enough? And the VOI approach, you know, really aims to do so by trading off very explicitly the social impact expected from a given design against that design's cost. So yeah, VOI has just basically been really helpful as we think through, you know, all of these questions and as we try and make better decisions about which funding to pursue. But I realize I've talked a lot about the problem statement, and we should talk to you a little bit more now about what VOI actually entails. And so let me hand over to Zack to do that for you. Zack.
Thanks, Mallika, and thanks everyone for being here. You can go on to the next slide, Mallika, and even the one after that. Great. So what is VOI? Well, broadly speaking, it is a solution, we think maybe the best solution to the problem statement that Mallika just outlined. So it's a way to explicitly estimate the value and social impact of any new piece of information. It does so, and Mallika touched on this, largely via the premise that the main way that information has value in the social sector or the development sector is via improving decisions. So you're going to see us focus quite a lot on decisions and how evidence can or can't influence them in our estimate of its value. That's kind of a higher level philosophical choice that we're making, and thing that we believe in. Another thing that we believe in at a philosophical level, which is the last bullet point here, and which we're going to emphasize several times during this presentation, is that we think the explicit asking and explicit answering of these questions, we're really confident that that will be good, that will be an improvement over the status quo. Exactly how those questions are answered and the details of the methodology is where this is new and we're still relatively uncertain. And we think that probably from context to context, the specific methods you would use to answer the questions are going to change. And so what we're most confident in, if we can convince you of one thing today, we want it to be that a series of key questions are worth asking and should be asked out loud and explicitly. We're going to show you one way that we have used to answer them that we think works pretty well in certain contexts. But if you're trying to make your decision on whether we've convinced you or not, we'd like you to make it at the higher level. Are these questions worth asking and answering explicitly? And not so much based on the one specific method that we show you in the details here today. So with that said, let's go to the next slide. And what I mean by the key questions. Key questions are 4 of them. What's the decision? What do we know already? What can we learn? And is it worth learning? So that first question, what's the decision, has a really important sub-question, which is, and how will that decision be influenced by what we believe about the world or by evidence, which causes us to change what we believe about the world? But broadly speaking, this is like I promised, this starts us off in step 1, very decision focused. So the first thing we would do as an evaluator working with a decision maker, client, or partner is try to figure out what decisions are actually facing them. What options do they have, and what can they, and how will they choose among those options? And then, yeah, let's go to the next slide, and I'll continue down the details of question 1, and one more again. Sweet, thank you. Okay, so as promised, we're going to give you one simple example, but keep in mind that we think answering this question is possible even for much more complex projects. In our simple example here, we're imagining some sort of education intervention. The decision that's facing the decision makers is the scale at which to implement this education intervention. So we're imagining maybe they piloted it, they're in the course of piloting it now. So they're trying it out in some small areas of a given country, and the decision they're making is how widely to implement it in the future. So the scale of that program, and they're going to, the way that evidence can, or beliefs about the world can influence that decision is based on the impact on test scores that this education intervention is expected to have. So we've worked with the client in this example, and we've defined some rough decision thresholds for them, which we have here defined on the slide. So effectively, if the client believes that the program is going to improve test scores by anything between 0.15 standard deviations and 0.50 standard deviations, don't worry too much about the standard deviation part. We can explain what we mean by that later if you want. But if the test causes that level of impact, anything between 0.15 and 0.50, then they're going to scale it up to 100 districts. If what they think is the impact of the intervention is anything less than 0.15 standard deviations, they're going to stop their scaling plans and redesign the program, because that's not very impactful. It's not impactful enough to justify the scale up. And if it's really impactful, so over 0.50 standard deviations, then they're also going to stop and get more money in order to implement it even more widely than originally planned, because man, this thing is the most effective intervention they've got available to them in education, so they better get it to the whole country as quickly as possible. So we've worked, in this example, we've worked with our decision makers to define their decision, which is about scale, and the way that they're going to make it as a function of what they believe about the effectiveness of the program. So that's step 1. And let's go to the next slide. So step 2 is to figure out what we already believe to be true about the program. So we've set out a series of conditional statements about decisions, which are conditioned on what we think the effect of the program is. And then before we gather any new evidence, it's important for us to define what we currently believe about the effectiveness of the program, even without any new information. That's going to be one key task, one key aspect of the VOI approach, which can potentially help us avoid spending a lot of money on new information that isn't that useful. So what we mean when we do this is we often refer to what we currently believe before a study as a prior. All that means is our belief prior to collecting any given new piece of information. So we're going to construct priors, and we're going to do that. We're going to construct those prior beliefs as a function of a wide spectrum of information. Basically, anything that we think is relevant, anything that we think will help us do a better job of figuring out what the effectiveness of the program is going to be. can be included in our prior construction process. So we've got three big categories listed here on the slide. There's definitely other information we might think is relevant that falls outside these three categories, but these are three core examples that we wanted to highlight. So we're going to draw on the beliefs of our decision makers themselves. We're going to draw on the beliefs of experts in forecasting, like people with forecasting experience, and then we're going to draw on the beliefs or on information from literature on similar programs in other contexts. So those are three key sources that we're going to use to help us build our prior. And let's take a look at a prior on the next slide. When we say prior, we are talking about a statistical distribution. So they look like that. That one looks like maybe it's a normal distribution. They don't have to be normal. They can take any form you want. The key thing is that they attach different probabilities to different values for the decision relevant statistic, which in our example is the impact on test scores of an education intervention. So two key features to highlight of a prior. It's going to include our best guess, which is like the one value that we think is most likely to be true for the impact of the program on test scores, and it's going to encompass our uncertainty. So if we knew for sure what would happen in the future when we implement the program, then our best guess would be all we needed. We would just be sure that it's going to cause an increase in test scores of 0.19 standard deviations. In reality, we're never sure. So what we want to do is quantify our uncertainty as well by spreading out this probability distribution and giving some amount of probability to values that are gradually farther and farther away from our best guess. So when we have a prior, which is going to give us both our best guess and our uncertainty, then we can use that to figure out what the status quo decision should be. So if we've correctly defined and modeled the way that our client makes the decision and what our client currently believes, then it should just fall out of those two pieces of information what the client is currently doing. So that's what we call the status quo decision. And in this case, based on the client's best guess for program impact, which is something around 0.19 standard deviations, and on the decision thresholds that they define for us in step one, the status quo decision is to scale up the program to 100 new districts, because what the decision maker thinks its impact will be falls within that middle range in between those two impact thresholds. All right, so we've got a status quo decision, but because we're uncertain about the true impact of the program, there's some risk in that decision. It could be wrong. So now we put the decision thresholds onto our distribution, and we can see that our distribution or our prior belief, because of its uncertainty, affords some probability to the chance that the program is actually not effective enough to justify our status quo scale-up plan. So in this case, it's about 30%. Based on our beliefs and our uncertainty about them, we think that there's about a 30% chance that this status quo scaling plan is actually not justified by the true impact. And that's what we call decision risk, which at a conceptual level is kind of the reason to gather new information, is because your decisions are risky based on things that you don't know, and the new information can reduce that risk by helping you know new things. Let's go to the next slide. And I just said all of that. So there is what I just said. All right. So then the next step, step 3 in the VOI process, is figuring out what we can learn from any given new piece of information. We do that via simulation. I'm going to go quickly through a textual and then a visual explanation of what we mean by simulating study designs. This is where we get weedsiest in this section of the presentation, so it's going to be quick, and we're happy to answer more questions about it later on. So when we say simulation, what we mean is we are going to define a world in which we know the truth. So we're going to randomly create a true effect for our program, and then we're going to randomly create a study result that is based on that true effect. So it's not going to tell us exactly the truth in most cases, because every study has uncertainty. But it's going to tell us something that's based on the truth. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the truth in each simulation from our simulated study. And then because we know the truth, because we simulated it, we can then compare what we were doing in the status quo based on our old information to the truth. And then again, we can figure out, after having done this study and learned what the simulation tells us we're going to learn from the study, we can figure out how our decision might change. And then we can compare the status quo decision to the post-study decision, and that is our measure of the value of the study. So remember, we're focusing our estimate of value of information on how it causes decisions to improve. And this is exactly how we do that explicitly and mathematically in any given simulation. It's by comparing the decision you would make if you had perfect information, if you knew the capital T truth, to the decision you made with or without, and then with the new piece of information. And if you do that many, many times, then you have an average or an expected in statistical terms value of that piece of information. So if we go to the next slide, we'll show you everything I just said in pictures. So we have our same prior. Take our word for it. This is the same thing. It's just a differently formatted graph. This is the same prior we've been working with throughout this example. And we have our decision threshold which would cause us to halt scaling, which is a little bit to the left of the center of that prior, which is where we had about a 30% decision risk as we estimated before. So then on the next slide. In each simulation, we're going to pick a truth. We're going to pick a fake truth using this very same prior distribution to help us figure out how likely any given fake truth is to occur in the real world. We're going to simulate one of them. So now we know in this world that our truth also falls above the halt scaling threshold. So in this world, the correct decision is in fact to continue the 100 district scaling program. And then on the next slide. Because that's the truth, it's also likely to be what a new study tells us. In this case, because of some sampling variance or other sources of uncertainty in the study design, our study result is a little bit above the truth, whereas our prior belief was a little bit below the truth. And then on the next slide, we're going to integrate what we used to believe and what we currently, and what we learned from the study into a new belief. It's called a posterior in fancy Bayesian language, but it just means what we believe after we did the study. And as we can see, it's still above the halt scaling option. So in this case, we didn't change any decisions because the study left us believing that the program is effective enough to justify the 100 district scaling plan. And that was correct because the truth, which we know in the simulation in the background, was also high enough to justify continuing the scaling. Next. Now that doesn't always happen, of course. Sometimes our decision might be wrong, and this is actually what creates the opportunity for new information to have social impact. So here in this scenario, our simulated truth falls below the threshold which justifies continued 100 district scaling plan. So in fact, the correct decision here would be to halt scaling and do some program redesign. And next slide. We're fortunate enough here that our study also concludes that it gives us an estimate for program impact, which is below the halt scaling threshold. Next slide. And when we integrate that with our prior, our new belief also falls below that halt scaling threshold. So we changed the decision, whereas the status quo decision was to expand to 100 districts. Now we are going to decide to halt scaling and do some program redesign, which is in fact the correct decision, or the decision we would have made if we had perfect information, if we knew the truth in our simulated world. So we just do that a lot. That's the approach to valuing a new study. Tens of thousands of times as a reasonable estimate for how many times we would do this before we think we're converging on the actual expected value of a study design. But that's the point. You can see in those two cases that we gave you, the results can differ from case to case. And so what we really want to know is what is the average results over many, many cases. And I'm happy to talk about the methodology that we used here more later. Of course, we would be doing sensitivity checks on the assumptions underlying the prior and that sort of thing to make sure that we aren't overly dependent on any of our assumptions. But this is all going to be, it's all going to be based around this. This is the basic methodology. We create a fake world. We figure out if the decision is right or wrong in that fake world, and if a study makes it righter or wronger in that same fake world, and then we average. Next slide.
And just to lay the foundation for an idea that's going to come up later in this in the presentation is just that you'll notice that because in each simulation, the truth that we draw in order to run the simulation and make that comparison of like decision we would make with the study, decision we'd make without the study, and the decision we would make if we knew the perfect truth, like that fake truth, that fake like estimate is drawn from the prior distribution. And so like all of the conclusions are like pretty sensitive to like what that distribution looks like. And that's why that prior generation step in BOI is like pretty important. It's one we're thinking about a lot, and it's the one where currently we focused most of the internal testing on. But more on that later. I just wanted to make that quick addition. Back to you, Zach.
Indeed. Thanks, Mallika.
Sorry, Zach, may I just
Yep.
quick? Yes, so we have a lot of questions coming, which is great, but there's one question that asks you to maybe explain a little bit more how to simulate the truth randomly. Would that be something that you'd be willing to talk a little bit about, just to clarify?
Sure, and it's basically what Mallika just said. So we use the prior distribution as the source of the random draw. That's kind of plan A. Like the primary method for simulating the truth is to pull a draw from the prior. So if you ask yourself, how would I simulate the truth such that it is as realistic as I can possibly make it? The way you would answer that question is by constructing your prior distribution. You would say like, well, what's the most likely value that I think the truth could take? Okay, so that's my center. How uncertain am I about that? How wide does my distribution need to be? Once you're done sort of answering those questions about your belief, what you have is a prior distribution. So therefore, like your best guess at how to simulate accurate priors is to pull them from how to simulate accurate truths is to pull them from your prior distribution. But then as Mallika said, that means that this whole methodology is quite sensitive to the accuracy of the prior, which means two things. One, it means we do a lot of sensitivity analyses when we do value of information to see how much our value changes if our prior is wrong in certain ways. And then two, like Mallika said, we've been spending a lot of time working on making our priors more accurate, and actually more importantly, getting a better sense of just how accurate or inaccurate they are, so that we can adjust our evaluation strategies to what we actually expect to be the quality of these prior distributions. And we're happy to talk in endless detail about how we're doing that, because it is, as Mallika said, what we've been spending the most internal time on. Yeah, so thanks Chau and Mallika, and happy to come back to that again in questions as desired. All right, so what we've got here is kind of our numerator, our benefit numerator, or the benefit side of the cost-benefit ratio that Mallika mentioned earlier is usually a lot less certain than the cost estimate. So the expected result over many, many simulations of a given study design gives us the expected value in improved decisions of that given study design. And then we can compare that to the cost of that given study design to help us make a more informed decision about whether it's worth incurring that cost to get that new information or not. There's plenty more complication though, even at that stage, even after we've done all of this work. So we've laid out 3 examples here on this slide for how to actually do that benefit cost comparison with gradually increasing complication and therefore like hopes at accuracy. But this is another place where we're not sure just how far it makes sense to go in the sophistication of this analysis for each given client or context. And so very open to feedback on this as well. So just to go through these examples that we've got here, the simplest way to do this is to just tell you how much it costs for a given reduction in decision risk based on the process so far. So we told you that our decision risk in our example before doing a study was about 30%. We could tell you that some given study design reduces your decision risk from 30% to 20%. So you get a 10 percentage point reduction in decision risk. And then we can tell you how much we think that study will cost. And then you can sort of qualitatively or intuitively as a decision maker decide whether that's enough of a risk reduction to justify the cost. There's some serious problems with that method though, because as a decision maker, you probably shouldn't just care about whether or not your decision is right. You should also care about how wrong it was when it was wrong, like how big a difference was it? So adding one other level of complication to the methodology would be to do that. It would be to say, okay, well, how important or how big is the change in decision that's provoked by this new information? So one obvious way to do that is to measure the size or the importance of a decision as the amount of money that it causes people to move. At the end of the day, a lot of these decisions are basically come down to resourcing. And so you could say, well, the study causes you to reallocate $500,000 of your budget, or in this case, $5 million of your budget towards different programs than you would have done without the study, and it costs $500,000 to do. So that gives you, you can say like, it costs you X number of cents in order to reallocate the average dollar. So that at least gives you a measure of how important the change in decision is, or how large the change in decision is. Now even that isn't perfect, because you might be reallocating a ton of money from one really impactful program to another really impactful program. So you've made a really, really large change in terms of funds reallocated, but the way you affect the world hasn't changed that much. So really the ideal way to make these decisions, or to make use of value of information estimates, is by comparing the actual social impact of the different options that can be chosen with different pieces with different amounts of information. That is really the right way to do it. That's how we think our clients, or how I personally think our clients should be thinking of these decisions. But this is another place where we're applying that philosophical caveat or note that we made at the very beginning, which is, we definitely think this is the right way to be thinking about these questions. We're not sure if they should be precisely and quantitatively estimated in every case. So to do this last bullet, this most complicated and most accurate value of information comparison analysis, cost benefit analysis, you would need to have moral weights that compare all of the potential uses of funds to each other, and allow you to say how much social impact value you get from each one. And we recognize that that's going to be tricky for a lot of clients and not possible in a lot of contexts. And so we think asking the question is a bare minimum and definitely better than the status quo, but we're open to lots of variance in how deeply or sophisticatedly we answer it. All right, that is it. And now I'll hand it off to Chau to talk about the future.
Great, thanks a lot, Zach, for a very thorough explanation of our methodology. And so I'm going to continue by kind of looking ahead and explaining to you guys what we have been doing internally in order to refine our methodologies and asking the questions that may help us refine our general approach. So first of all, just to put things into perspective a little bit, I think that Mallika and Zach have both alluded to this point, and even some of our attendees have posed questions that relate to this, but we understand that most real world decisions are more complex than the example that we have provided here, which is actually a stylized example to illustrate our methods. But as Miriam has rightly pointed out, like especially within the context of working with governments, many of whom we work with, policymakers are constantly faced with very complex sets of questions that cannot be easily quantified and evaluated with experimental designs or quantitative methods. However, I think, as Zach has said, we do still believe in the merit of the value formation approach, because most fundamentally, it is about asking these questions. And as complicated as we think that the decision, like the sets of considerations that are facing the decision makers, we do believe that too rarely the decision makers are asking these questions, and just by trying to ask and answer these questions, even if you come up with an imperfect answer, will lead to better thinking, and ultimately it will lead to better research funding and design decisions at a sector level. And so to the next slide. And so, yeah, so like in order to refine our approach and trying to kind of contextualize this approach within the development sector, we have been asking ourselves some questions in terms of methodologies. We have been trying to understand what are the best methodologies available for eliciting priors and modeling how evidence affects decisions. And also in parallel, how accurate are these elicited priors and decision models? So for these two questions, we have been doing a lot of experiments within our organization in various forms. Most notably, we have been trying to do what we call prediction tests, where, for example, our team would be, let's say, take a given study on a specific program intervention. And what we would do is that we would anonymize that study, which means that we would hide the name of the authors, and then we would conceal the true effect that was found by that study. We then collect a set of studies that are about similar interventions of the hidden study, and then we would do a kind of review on these studies to find, what is for each study, what is the estimated effect, what is the uncertainty, which is a standard deviation found by each study. We would then invite our colleagues at IDinsight to participate in a prediction activity where we would give them the set of studies that we have reviewed, told them about the program effect, and then ask them to form their prior based on what they have read in the expected, in the reviewed studies. And they would have to come up with their priors and uncertainty about the estimates in the hidden study. And so by doing so multiple times on various topics, ranging from sanitation to education to conditional cash transfers, we've been trying to kind of determine what are the best methods and how accurate are elicited priors that we have been able to collect. In addition, in terms of methodology, we've also been trying to kind of think a little bit more broadly in terms of what are the factors or the context that can affect the accuracy of the decisions or priors. In terms of applications, so this is where we try to kind of contextualize our approach in the development sector. So the questions that we have been asking ourselves are, first, how would funders respond to this line of thinking about these decisions? And on that note, we will be very interested to hear from you during the discussion sections on what you think, like a typical decision makers who are faced with very complex decisions on policies, on politics, would respond to this approach. And then tied to that is our expectation realistic? Can we always expect that in any given context, the decision maker will be able to neatly tie program decisions to specific statistics? And will they even know this ahead of time? Like, can they predict their own reactions, and they will be able to tell us that? And I think that this is a point that I believe Hamza very rightly raised in one of the comments that we have received so far. And then more broadly, what are some other ways in which we and our client can conceptualize value? So far, you have seen a very specific definition of value, but is there any way that we could broaden our definition of values to suit a wider range of contexts and perspectives, knowing that not all decision makers who are presented this approach will be looking at it from the same point of view? And so that is something that we are very keen to explore and to hear from you, if possible, during the discussion section. So with that, I will conclude my section, and yeah, we can move on to talking about all the great questions that you've been having so far. Thanks.
Thanks, Chau. Yeah, so thanks everyone for the questions you've been sending in the chat. Let's see. I have a couple of these that I kept track of that I'll give quick responses to, and then I think maybe I'll throw it back to Mallika and Chau, because I know you guys were collecting some questions while I was speaking, and we can make sure that we get to those as well. So let's see. First, there's a great point from, I think it's Miriam, noting that decision maker decisions don't depend only on evidence. We wholeheartedly agree. We've talked a bit about our prior accuracy testing efforts. We have another internal effort, which is a little bit less developed, but we think is even more important, which is about getting better at estimating exactly how sensitive any given decision is to new evidence, and figuring out how good we are even at figuring out how our clients are making their decisions or not. We might be very poor, but we should know. So that's to say we agree with you that this is a source of great uncertainty that we need to spend some more time on. We don't, though, see that as a reason not to pursue the VOI approach for a couple of reasons. First is that for the VOI approach, as we've described it here, to work, we don't need the decision to be based entirely or mostly or even a lot on new evidence. We just need to be able to do a reasonable job of figuring out how important a role evidence actually plays in it. So like mathematically, you can think of it as we need to know the partial derivative with respect to evidence of the decision with respect to evidence. So we know that there's a whole bunch of other factors that influence that decision, maybe a lot more than evidence. But VOI works as long as we can figure out how big of an influence evidence actually has. And then the second, probably more important point, is that asking that question explicitly, as the VOI approach forces us to do, will cause us to recognize cases where pretty clearly the other constraints on the decision or the other influences on the decision are going to prevent the decision maker from using evidence very much at all. And we shouldn't be spending their money on gathering that evidence in those contexts. We should be letting them spend that money on programming or something else good for the world. So asking the question explicitly, even if we know we're going to be answering it with a great deal of uncertainty, may cause us to avoid some otherwise what would otherwise be errors. And then another point is that we think it's reasonable that, at least in some contexts, working with a decision maker to put down on paper or say out loud, or maybe even say publicly how their decision is influenced by evidence will make it more likely to actually ultimately be influenced by evidence. So Karen Levy and some of her colleagues at Evidence Action have coined the term pre-policy plan, and they have, at least in one published case, used that to great effect. Just the idea that if decision makers can say ahead of time how they intend to use evidence to make a decision, then they'll be much more likely to actually use evidence to make that decision later, because they're on paper and committed socially and maybe publicly to doing so. So those are three reasons why we think the approach applies very well, and in fact is part of addressing the problem or the challenge that not all decisions are made entirely on evidence. In fact, probably no decisions are made entirely based on evidence. Yeah, so love that question, love that concern. It's on our minds. We think VOI is a good response to it. Let's see. There's a question, I think, from Andres about the sophistication of clients or the interest of clients in some of the statistical nuance of these methods. Point taken there as well. We definitely wouldn't give exactly this presentation, let alone anything more technical, to every client. And we wouldn't expect every client to be interested in getting involved in all of the weeds of this methodology in the background. Again, though, I'm not sure that that is a reason not to apply the methods. As you noted, I think in your question, there are lots of things that we do, like confidence intervals, like randomization, which are hard to understand if it's not your job to understand them. But we still do them because we think they're the best way of getting answers, learning something about the world that we can then help our clients use to make better decisions. So I think, for me, at least speaking for myself, I think if we're convinced that VOI is the right way to decide what information to invest in, then we should use VOI to help us make recommendations to clients about what information to invest in. And then there's a separate strategic communications question, which is about how do we communicate that recommendation to each individual client? How much do we think they want to and are capable of understanding how we arrived at that recommendation versus they're going to have to take our word for it? But I think that is independent of the right method to answering the question. At least to a large extent. But yeah, we'd love to hear reactions to that take as well. I have one more, which I think is relatively methodological, and I'll get through quickly. Let's see. There's a question, I forget who asked this, I'm sorry, but about how to prioritize among questions that are easy to answer rigorously versus questions that are more relevant or more decision linked. And again, shockingly, I think value of information is a great way to answer that question. So the value of information, as we've laid out, is a function both of how much it is likely to change and improve a decision. And I guess we haven't said this quite explicitly, but it's totally possible for a bad study to make decisions worse. And when you simulate that bad study, if you do a reasonable job at expressing how bad it can be, like if you include estimates of measurement error or selection bias or anything else that could cause the study to give you bad information, then you can figure out under what circumstances it actually increases decision risk or makes decisions wrong. So you can trade off in that case the accuracy of the evidence a given study can provide against the relevance of the questions, the decision relevance of the questions that it answers. And you can give an estimate to which of two study options, the one that's more relevant but less rigorous, or the one that's more rigorous but less relevant, is most likely to provide social impact. That requires a lot of assumptions. Those are difficult things to measure. But already, when we decide to do one of those and not the other, we are implying that we know the answer to the question, which one is more socially impactful. And I think what I believe most strongly is that we should say that out loud, and we should be as explicit as possible about those implied conclusions so that people can challenge us on them and tell us if they think that they're wrong, as opposed to leaving them kind of underneath our logic, implied by the decision that we take, but not communicated. All right, I'm muting myself literally and metaphorically. Can show what other questions.
Thanks for those explanations, Zach. And yeah, thanks a lot for the questions. We're trying our best to record all of them. Also, just like send us a message in the chat if you just like to ask your question live. I'd like to take the one on the simplicity of the method and our current thoughts about how well this would sit and be used by decision makers. And very much on our minds as well. I think to take a step back, when we think about what are the points in this process where decision makers are really involved, there's two key ones, right? There's one where we get them to kind of explicitly, put down their decision model. So to say, okay, we're taking a certain set of decisions about the program, that is based on like what we think about the program's impact in the world is likely to be. And that impact can be, the number, it can be like the percentage points by which like that intervention increases like test scores, but it could be a broader notion of impact as well. And I think hopefully that, I think someone made this point about how do we think about like impact more broadly, and it can accommodate that as well. So they need to be involved at that stage of saying, okay, like if this is the impact, then we do this. If that's the impact, we do that. So I think we think there's not much math involved there, but there is that whole, like exercise of getting decision makers to like say that explicitly, which by itself may be very challenging for various like political or other reasons. And so that's one place where, although it's not super mathy and it's not very technical, we do expect that to be, a challenge, even though it's kind of an extension of what they're doing in their heads anyway. The other part where we want decision makers, or we need decision makers to be involved, is in that step where we get them to forecast what they think the impact of their program is. Again, here impact could be understood more broadly, and that's methodological work that we need to do. But getting them to predict the impact of their program, again, I think is an extension of what they're doing already. So when they do make a decision about, what scale to operate at, whether to scale up something that's been piloted, whether to pilot something, there is some underlying logic and thinking there. And what this tries to do is just to make that explicit. The math and the whole construction of the prior and the simulations, like all of that, it's something we could go into with the decision maker if they don't think the results or the outcome of this is credible, but it's not really required like for participation. Like from our perspective, where we really need them to be involved and to like have a participation in this process is that step of saying, okay, like how do I make my thinking and my decisions like explicit? And that's why we think this is valuable. As I think Chau said earlier, like doing that like helps make, I mean, the whole process could stop even before we do any of the simulation. Like just making that explicit could reveal that maybe the decision that's being made in status quo is in conflict with what they're saying it should be, right? Like that itself is valuable. Sometimes doing VOI will help highlight those instances. But then you could kind of proceed to go through the entire process. So like basically, I think how we're thinking about it is that there is a lot of like math and kind of like more sophisticated stuff going on here that is a part of this approach, but there are definitely ways to keep the focus of this, relatively simple. And at its heart, at its core, it's kind of really about making things and decisions that are already being made, but like in the background, just making them more explicit. And I think that's where we think a lot of the value lies, and also some of the challenges lie when interacting with actual decision makers. Okay. Cho, do you want to take any of the other questions that have come in? We have four or five more minutes before we should try and wrap. So
No, I think that like both you and Zach have covered a lot of the questions. Actually, I found a very interesting questions, and I wonder if you and Zach, you'd like to take that, which is how open are clients to null results? Because in academia, null results rarely get published and valued. And it's from Madhav.
yeah, thanks, Madhav. I mean, I think in our experience has definitely been a mixed record. You know, there have been cases where like evaluations have found null or negative results, and it's been difficult. There have been instances where it has been taken on board, and often those instances were the kinds of client contexts and situations where it was discussed ahead of time that this is a possibility, and it was discussed what would happen if that kind of null result was found. Yeah, so I think that's like a really quick insight into that. One other question from Madhav that was actually interesting was about how VOI could be useful when we think about whether to pursue evaluations that we can measure with the sufficient level of rigor versus evaluations that are useful to measure, even if we can't do them at that same level of rigor. And I think like the way I see VOI as tying in is basically by making that question of value really explicit. I think at IDinsight we don't go chasing evaluations that we think will produce like the best possible, like most rigorous results. It is very tailored to what the decision maker, the policy maker, the foundation leader needs. And what VOI does is it helps really quantify that usefulness, like what would be useful. Like it doesn't have to be answered just anecdotally or just kind of with different types of logic. There is a way through VOI to kind of really put a number on that usefulness. And that number is answering a certain, there is a certain entry point into that question of usefulness. There are other ways to conceptualize usefulness, but this is just one way to really put a number on usefulness and use that to guide kind of, which evaluations we should pursue, which evaluations funders should pursue, which evaluations decision makers should invest in and take program funding away from. And so that I think that could be useful in that way. Trying to see other questions coming in. Meanwhile, Zach, Cho, feel free to jump in and answer any other questions that have come through.
I guess I'll just quickly respond again to Andres, who asked if we had any cases of using this internally at IDinsight, and totally get the maybe the implication of your question. Like, if you guys really believe this, why are you? We do believe this, and we are using it, and we have some new use cases that are on the way. Not able to really speak publicly about them yet, but we will as soon as we can. And yeah, definitely, we expect to learn a lot from iteration and from some early failures of applying these methods. So we are jumping in wherever we think it makes sense for our clients and for social impact for us to do so. And yeah, we'll report back to the broader community as we learn through doing.
Yeah, this is very much an ongoing piece of work, and that means that like we continue to be open to thoughts and feedback on this. Like I put our emails on here. You can find also our contacts on the IDinsight website. And I think this is a stage in development where like tons of feedback is really welcome, including ways to solve some of these kind of gnarly problems around eliciting this information and actually using it in practice. So yeah, I think do reach out to us if you have additional thoughts. Couple of other questions coming in. We're at time, so please feel free to jump off if you have the next thing to go on to. But Zach, Cho, do you guys have a few minutes to stick around and try and answer these final few questions? Cool. Trying to wrap my head around the question from Hamza. If you look at decisions retrospectively and impact that was achieved with certain interventions, do they show that testing belief faith prior usually led to the expected impact? I think this is a question around prior accuracy. Is that right?
Yeah, it could be about prior accuracy, maybe just prior decision model accuracy too.
Yeah, that's
I
true.
think
Yeah.
like we definitely think that that is worth doing. Unfortunately, we haven't been systematically collecting priors from clients. So we don't have
Yeah.
any good measurements of what we believed before a study in the past. But that's coming. We're starting to collect those now. So we will be gathering evidence like this over time. And I totally agree that maybe by us working with the impact measurement team, also at IDinsight, working together, there's a ton of potential for us to figure out how good we are at predicting when projects are going to be more and less impactful, which should help the organization make better decisions about what work to take on, with a similar lens to the way we think of VOI, but with a slightly different methodology. So yeah, that sounds super high potential. We agree. I don't know, Mallika.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I think there's a world in the future where we just have a lot more information on like what we believed, what clients believed, what panned out, and therefore like are kind of retrospectively able to assess how impactful things were. I think like our entry point to this is like how much of that can we do, ahead of time, and of course the answer to that is imperfect, but it's worth doing because sometimes the consequences of just investing in a study can mean that 500K, a million, 2 million, 5 million is getting pulled away from something else that is potentially more valuable than the information from doing that study. So I think like that's the value of coming in ahead of time and trying to do it, even though obviously that's based on a bunch of assumptions and a bunch of probabilistic type thinking. Yeah, so I think that is all the questions. Seeing a final one from Madhav, can you figure out when clients actually want to use the evidence for policy versus when they actually want to use it to merely justify something? I mean, I think VOI is agnostic to that distinction to a certain extent. I mean, it's all about the decision model, like, and the uncertainty around what they believe about the world. Like, if for them, they need to show, or like, justifying anything is based on like a certain expectation of the program's impact in the world. The decision risk is still relevant in the context of that like justification type use case. For example, they may want to justify to a funder that they should keep funding the program. For us, that kind of decision risk is, it's no worse than a decision that is around like scaling up something, become a policy type decision. So yeah, that's my perspective. But I wonder if Zach and Chau, you guys disagree.
Yeah, I think you got it, Mallika. Like that's that question is an input into the decision model that we would build, and yeah, we should figure out how good we are at, like, to your question, like, your literal question motto is like, can you tell? And yeah, we should figure out whether we can tell or not when clients are actually going to use our evidence, and we should try to spend more time generating evidence that they are actually going to use. So yeah, I think that's just what Mallika said.
Actually, to add a question to that too, I wonder whether or not this is not something that we've already done a little bit as an organization, which is that I understand that when we are looking for clients, we try to kind of like select for clients who we know are genuinely interested in using the evidence. And that's one of the criteria that we use for our scoping. Or even just in the initial discussions with the client, sure, maybe this is an imperfect way of selecting clients. And, it's always one of those things where maybe the client's true intentions are never clear to us. And we only really learn about what the client really wants when the evidence comes out. But do you think in your experience as managers, this is something that is part of the conversation that we had upfront with the client, where we asked them like, okay, are you planning to use the evidence generated from the studies for like what are the goals, and how has the client reacted to those kinds of conversations? Like has there been any cases in which you found that the client's later reactions to the evidence surprised you? So maybe we can speak a little bit more about that. That would be very interesting. I'm not a manager, and both of you were or are, so I feel like you both will have a lot of insights, or other managers at IDinsight who are attending the session. Your insights are more than valuable to us at this point. So.
I was gonna let you go first or someone else, Mallika, but
You unmuted, so you go.
be quick. Yeah, so I think that when we're at our best, we are asking this question more explicitly, but we're not always at our best. I think sometimes we do something close, which I worry is not actually doesn't produce the same output at all in some contexts, where we say like, what are your learning goals, or what do you want to know? And I just think that's not like, human beings can answer that question in a variety of ways, not all of which are related to decision relevance. So I do think sometimes we have clients who really want to know something because they're intellectually curious, which is awesome, but maybe not how we should drive our work, or because they're hoping the evaluation will like make them feel better. It will show them that their program is working really well. But they couldn't articulate and maybe don't have a decision which will change based on the results. And so I think we'll be better at picking what we do and who we work with if we're asking explicitly, okay, I understand that you want to know that. How will your decisions change? Like, tell me what results will cause you to implement differently or move funds around differently. I think if we get really explicit, I think we may find that the answer to that question is actually quite different from what are your learning goals. What do you think, Mallika?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then I also think one challenge that we've discussed in the past is for someone who just really wants to do a study, like there's an aspect of like rationalization here as well, right? Like the decision model is something that they state. And I guess one risk when we get them to put their thoughts and their like linkages down explicitly is that they would basically put down a model that justifies that current approach, which is fine. And it would be interesting to see what that means for the value of the new information, because yeah, I think that's, so yeah, I think like this is a really interesting area of thought. Like we are in a fairly early stage of development with this work, and I think as we do this more with real world clients, like we've been doing this with like more past like project cases so far, but as we kind of execute this more and more with actual clients, I think there'll be a lot of learning for us, a lot of like reevaluating some of these approaches. So all of that is important stuff to look forward to in the future. We're about 10 minutes over time, so we should probably wrap. Thanks everyone again for all the participation and the feedback. Lots for us to think about. And as I said before, we are available on our emails, and IDinsight is via social media. So just feel free to reach out if you're thinking about this in 10 days. I hope you are. We certainly will be. So would love to hear from you. And thanks very much for attending.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See the chat.